In this video, we're going to consider the continuity of species, and before we start thinking about continuity of species, we probably ought to think about the word species. So there are lots of different ways to define the word species, and even today, depending on the emphasis that you want to place and the use you're going to make of the word, there are still lots of ways, and it has been an evolving word ever since it was first coined back in the 1600s. So one way that we could think of about it is that it's a group of organisms that share a common ancestor. So if you're thinking about this, this would be a phylogenetic way to consider the word species, thinking about how things are related to each other. But if you think about it, this has some issues because everything is related to everything else. So how far back do you take the common ancestor in order to define the word species? So another way we can define it is that individuals of the same species can successfully interbreed amongst themselves. And this is still used mostly today. This is a biological definition of the word species, and it's predominantly based on plant reproductive structures and was used a lot by Carl Linnaeus. He is a sort of famous Swedish biologist who named lots and lots and lots of organisms, and he was the one who used the binomial naming, where you have a genus and a species named together, like Homo sapiens, to distinguish one set of creatures or organisms from another. But there is another way that we can look at, and this involves how things look. So a collection of individuals which resemble each other more than they resemble anything else. But they can also breed together naturally and produce fertile offspring. So the fact that they look similar is to do with morphology, what it looks like, and this is important. This is the definition that Darwin was working with when he was thinking about on the origin of the species, and he was writing his book, which defined natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. So all of these are great and they're useful. None of them are outdated in and of themselves, but there are still some problems. So what about organisms that are separated from each other but can still reproduce if they had the option to? Now, bears are all from the same species, or at least gene flow has been shown between them, but obviously a polar bear that lives in the north doesn't really get access to a sun bear in the south. What about organisms that don't even use sexual reproduction as their mechanism of reproducing? Maybe they're asexual. So if that's the case, how does species work for them if we're looking at things being able to interbreed amongst themselves? We also have modern technology. So for modern technology, we have molecular information about protein and DNA. So if we've got this information, that's going to contribute a new layer to our understanding. And that's very important now that we can actually see how closely related things are from a DNA point of view. But again, how far back do you go? Because so many things share huge percentages of DNA that are the same. So that's the word species. Now we have to think about continuing a species. So how do you allow a species to continue moving forward, and what are the contributions of mitosis and meiosis, which are your cell replication processes, to the continuity of species? So let's have a think about how we would approach a question where we had to assess the impact of mitosis and meiosis on continuity of species. So we're looking in particular at reproductive processes. So I'm going to show you how my thought processes would work if I was going to tackle a question like this. So thinking about reproduction, I would want to think of what are the benefits of doing a reproductive or cell division type where you ended up with the same. So mitosis results in genetically identical things. The benefit of that is you can have more of the same, therefore the species is continuing, great. If you have meiosis happening, you have difference. You have genetic variation. You have the option to survive if conditions change. So that whole idea of adaptations doesn't need to be surviving to the point of a whole new species being produced, but it could just be a bit like the peppered moth example, where you can now camouflage better because there's difference, and that's thanks to variation that's happening within meiosis, within sexual reproduction. But there are also cons of being the same, so there are problems. You can't respond to evolutionary pressures, and there are cons of difference as well. If things become too different, you can't continue the same species because you've actually made a whole new species. You can no longer interbreed successfully and produce fertile offspring. Or you might have a mutation, which means that you're actually disadvantaged completely and you die in those situations. But then we have to remember that mitosis and meiosis are used, or mitosis in particular, is used for other things too. So benefits of the same, you can repair cells. So that's good for continuing species. Things don't die off just because of a simple cut or problem. Also, the immune system in humans benefits completely from mitosis because that's how we make more white blood cells. So we're able to actually survive and continue our species thanks to mitosis inside our immune systems. So there are lots of different ways you can take this. There are also some other issues which include things like cancer. So if you've got mitosis happening, lots and lots and lots of cells that are the same, that are being produced, if it's the wrong place and the wrong time, that might mean a discontinuity of species, so things might die off. So there are lots of different ways that you can take this, and that's why it's an assess question. So you have to make a judgment and bring all of your ideas together in a question, lay them down logically, and then come up with some assessment of the impact of mitosis and of meiosis on how they allow a species to continue.